So a little bit about our two presenters. Darren Stewart. Darren is a senior environmental protection officer with the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. Compliance section with a focus on municipal, solid, liquid, and hazardous waste inspections, staff support, training, and development. Prior to joining the ENV, Darren had been working in Alaska for 15 years. His education includes a graduate certificate from UAA in environmental regulations and permitting, and a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Arcadia University. He will be accompanied with Jennifer Pape as an Environmental Protection Officer with the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, ENV, Authorizations, South Municipal Liquid Waste Section. Man, those are long. Her role with ENV creates the working with wastewater authorization documents, municipal wastewater regulation registrations, permits, liquid waste management plans, and operational certificates. Answering questions about regulatory requirements and the authorization process. Jennifer is a registered professional chemist, Association of the Chemical Profession of British Columbia, with a Master's of Science from Victoria and a Bachelor of Science from the University of Calgary. Welcome, guys. I'll hand her over to you.
Thank you very much, and I hope we didn't wear you out with our intros there. We're a little bit wordy here at the ministry. So I hope you guys have all been enjoying your conference for the last day and a half or so, had some coffee, you're on the home stretch here in the afternoon, and we're excited to talk to you about wastewater today. All right, so moving into our presentation. As a starting point, we'd like to respectfully the territory and continuing relationships of the Lekwungen peoples, the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Masonic, with this beautiful land here where I'm located in Victoria. And to share some of what we've been doing on the land lately, me and my family got out for a little bit of late season blueberry picking. So this is a picture of my daughter Coraline and out enjoying the lovely surroundings out near Metchosin. So I hope you've had the opportunity to get outside and enjoy the good weather of our summer as well. All right, so let's get into what we've got coming up for you today. Our first point is going to be, whereabouts are we located in the ministry structure? So government is a big place, and we'd just like to bring you into whereabouts our teams fit within the overall picture. Next will be, what exactly is an authorization? So that word can cover a lot of different things, and we'll go into some details about how to understand your authorization, how to make changes, and a little bit more about how they work. As well, how do these fit into provincial legislation and regulations? So the legislation and regulation provides our framework for how we authorize folks, and we'll get into those details for you. How does environmental compliance work? As operators, I'm sure you're all very interested in how to stay in compliance and what you need to know. So Darren's our expert on that side of things, and he'll be talking to you guys about that today. He'll be including the compliance model and the framework that we have, as well as some common non-compliances that he comes across out when he's on his inspections. And to round it off, we'll talk a little bit about reporting requirements as well. All right, so moving on. This is the structure of the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. You can see at the top level, people are familiar with our old acronym MOE. We've switched that relatively recently. These days we go by ENV, and that's the highest level of the ministry where we're situated. Going a step down from there is the Environmental Protection Division. And within that division, you can see on my right-hand side of the slide, might be on the left for you guys, is all those different branches within the groups. So we're located in the Regional Operations branch. Stepping down into that branch, I'm in the authorizations team and Darren's on the compliance team. There's also a few others listed there as well, which support our overall processes. So who are we anyway? Well, the picture with the two girls here, I could make you guess which one I am, but this is me. And I'm with my colleague, Melanie Moser, who's also a member of the South Authorizations team. And I had to dig up a picture where I've got my gear on because for the most part, I'm in the office. I'm not out on the inspections as much as Darren is. But this is a lovely picture when we were out touring a facility and we got to see some late season fall pumpkins. And Darren Stewart, as I mentioned, is with our compliance section, and he'll be walking you through the second half of our presentation today. So what is an authorization? In order to discharge sewage, so treated wastewater here in BC, you have to be legally allowed to do that. And the way we accomplish this is through an authorization, which is a written document that if you're successful in our application process, there's a statutory decision, and you're issued an authorization document that tells you how you can discharge your wastewater, the amount you can discharge, and various other aspects of how you're allowed to get rid of your wastewater. An authorization can be a number of different things. It can be a permit, it could be a registration under the municipal wastewater regulation, or it could be something like a liquid waste management plan and operational certificate. Folks who are working with municipalities, you may have come across those before. Much less frequently very rare, are approvals, which are short-term types of authorizations. Okay, so once I know about the authorization, can I look at the authorization for my facility? You absolutely can. Authorizations are public record, so they're accessible to anybody. You can view your own facility or someone else's if you go to the database here, and I'll be able to circulate these links around for you later. I know they're a bit expensive with the naming, so we can get you that information. Once you're in the system and you've looked up an authorization document, there's various things it can contain. It may have information including the rate of the effluent discharged, the authorized works, sampling that's required, such as analytes and frequency, receiving environment monitoring you may be required to do, and there can be instructions for reporting data or non-compliances. As far as it goes, permits usually have a more in-depth rundown of these details. The MWR registration letters don't always have this information there because these details are documented in the regulation itself. So we're working a little bit to pull more of that information into the authorization documents for you, just to make it a more useful resource for everybody. What does this database look like? Well, here's a screenshot of the database for you. And as it shows, there's a number of different ways you can search for authorizations. You can search by the facility name, by the applicant, the authorization number, or type of waste, the region. If you're not sure how we've documented you in our system, you can use the wildcard character, which is a percent sign. So you'll see the example at the bottom of the slide there. If you were trying to look for Kamloops and you weren't sure how it was in the system, you could put a percent on either side of the loop, and that would pull up everything associated with Kamloops. So you might get multiple facility records, but you also might see multiple records in the database for your facility. Just as a heads up, if you're seeing multiple records, make sure you're referring to the most recent one. As authorizations are amended, you'll see different records in the database. So once you've got your authorization document and you've looked through it a little bit, and maybe you realize that something doesn't match your facility the way it is now. So how do you get that authorization document changed so it's reflecting the up-to-date information? Well, the way we do that is through our standard application process referred to as SAP. This all kicks off with an email to our permit admin folks, and there's contacts on our website for how to do that. There's some application forms you fill in, you send an email to those folks, and it goes into our intake phase, which extends for roughly a month. And what that is the very first assignment of a tracking number to your file. So for your request, you're going to have a specific reference number that you can refer to so that we know which application is yours. Once that step's complete and your number has been assigned, then we move forward into the preliminary application phase. And the intention of this phase is to help you understand the requirements that are needed for your facility. So if you are registering a facility under the municipal wastewater regulation for the first time, maybe you haven't seen all the requirements before, and this meeting is intended to help walk you through what the process is and what those requirements are. It's an opportunity to ask questions or to provide information about your project if you've got some of the details in place already. And that can extend for approximately 4 months. Usually we'll try and reach out fairly early just to get a meeting scheduled because it can take a while to get in touch and get everybody in the same virtual room. As a result of that pre-application phase, you're going to be given an application instruction document, which is a letter with a bunch of different references that you can refer to, and an information requirements table, which is a more detailed tabulated version of the requirements of the regulation. Then it's over to you guys as the applicants to go ahead and put together a final application package. And when it comes back into the ministry, it goes through a screening phase. So there's two parts to the screening phase. There's an administrative one that is, did you fill out your forms? Have we got everything we need? And then a technical screen, which is the first quick screen to make sure there's no big parts of your application that are missing. Once that phase is completed, you move on into the review and decision phase. Depending on the complexity of the application, if it's considered a medium complexity, you're looking at around a 6-month timeline. For a high complexity application, you're looking closer to 10 months. And just a note that on your final application phase, when it's over to you guys as the applicants, you've got a window of 3 months from the time your tracking number was, or pardon me, 3 months, 3 years from the amount of time your tracking number was assigned to complete your final application. So sometimes these timelines surprise folks a bit, but keep in mind you can always bring it down by almost a couple of years, depending on how quickly you get the application back into the ministry. So that's just a little bit about how our process works for making updates. If you're doing something like a permit amendment, you can see that it probably wouldn't take the full extent of the time to do that for you. This is more focused around the amount of time it would take for a new registration process to go through. So having looked at what's an authorization, how do we get it, how do we change it, where do we fit in terms of legislation and regulation? So we rely on these documents as our framework to provide the authorizations. The two main ones you'll hear us refer to are the Environmental Management Act and the Municipal Wastewater Regulation. Authorizations are specific to those different items. So if you have a permit, it's issued directly under the Environmental Management Act, whereas if you have a registration, it would be under the Municipal Wastewater Regulation. And what that tells you is that tells you where to look for the requirements that you need to meet. Always, it's the responsibility of the discharger to ensure works are adequately designed, constructed, and operated, and that discharge quality complies with applicable legislation and regulation. So that's just a reminder that once you've got your authorization document, it's in your hands to understand what those requirements are and to comply with the requirements that have been set out. So who knows, maybe in your spare time, you might like to reach out and read a little bit of the legislation and regulation. It's a great way to get familiar with what some of the requirements are. I know you guys are all busy folks, so if you come up with questions, that's what we're here for, to help you answer. Moving into a couple flowcharts here about how these processes work. So this is looking at registration under the Municipal Wastewater Regulation. You'll see that there's only liquid waste inputs that are allowed to go into the system. So if you have something like hazardous waste, that's not allowed to be discharged into a treatment plant. We start out under the Environmental Management Act, which prescribes the regulation of municipal sewage under the Waste Discharge Regulation, Schedule 1. Then we move down into the Municipal Wastewater Regulation. And what the scope of that regulation is, it covers any discharge to water, as well as discharges to ground that are bigger than or equal to 22.7 cubic meters a day. So when you're picturing what kind of facilities are under this regulation, it would be things like municipal wastewater treatment plants, maybe condo developments, resorts and campgrounds. There's a lot of different styles of facilities that end up falling under the municipal wastewater regulation. Then to look at authorizations that are under EMA, the Environmental Management Act, there's a couple different kinds. There's that approval, which isn't very common that I mentioned. It's the short-term one. There's the liquid waste management plan that is more tied into municipalities. And along with that is the operational certificate. Or there's the permit, which, as I mentioned, is kind of an older format of authorization for us. The next few slides are pretty wordy. You don't have to read every last word on them, but I'd like you to get the idea that this talks about what's allowed with amending a permit. So I'm going to read out the bold here. A director may not issue or subject to subsection 4 amend a permit authorizing the introduction of waste into the environment if the introduction is governed by a regulation. So that's the situation we're in here. As well as the Environmental Management Act, there is the Municipal Wastewater Regulation. And what that means is we have a very limited scope where we're able to amend permits. So a lot of the questions I get are about, hey, what does this change mean for my permit? You know, my flow is increasing. Does that mean I need to register under the municipal wastewater regulation? How does that work? And that's what this section talks about. So there's the option for a director on receipt of the application or his or her own initiative to amend a permit if the amendment is necessary for the protection of the environment, in the opinion of the director. Or there's some more specific processes as well, which include a change of ownership or name, address, a change in the amount of the quality of the discharge, an increase of not more than 10%. That's an important mile marker for you folks, because if your maximum authorized flow is going to change by more than 10%, that is a trigger that will put you under the municipal wastewater regulation. So just a point to put on your radar, something to keep in mind as you're going through your wastewater authorization thoughts. You might say, okay, you've gone through all this, but there's a bit of a gap. What about smaller systems that discharge to ground? And yep, absolutely, that is covered by the sewage system regulation. And that's actually under the Public Health Act, which means it's the Ministry of Health folks that are dealing with that side of the regulation. So if you're near the 22.7 mark, then it's worth taking the time to determine which regulation you're going to fall under, the sewage system regulation or the municipal wastewater regulation. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to us, and we're happy to talk about that as well. So a quick slide just to show you the sewage system regulation, very similar to the others, except under the Public Health Act. Discharges to ground and less than 22.7 cubic meters a day. For this one, you can picture something like a holding tank, a family residence or duplex. Those are the type of facilities that tend to fall under the sewage system regulation. All right, so now having breezed through all that information, how do you guys get in touch with us if you forget everything I just told you? Well, it's really easy. Please reach out to us. There's 2 emails, north and south of the province, authorizations.south@gov.bc.ca, authorizations.north@gov.bc.ca. If you're not sure who to start with, pick one and send us an email. We'll make sure you get to the right place. And with that, having covered off our authorizations, I'm going to turn it over to Darren to talk a little bit about compliance.
Great. Excuse me. Thanks, Jen. Next slide, please. We have a combined presentation, so Jen's going to be driving the presentation today. As mentioned, my name is Darren Stewart. I'm a senior compliance officer based in Nanaimo, and I deal a lot with municipal liquid waste. So I'm one of the main inspectors in the Vancouver Island, Gulf Islands area. So I was going to touch on compliance because there is 2 hands to these liquid waste discharge authorizations. Is you get the authorization, and then we in the compliance group follow up to inspect. So we do have a video that we were going to show, but we're having issues kind of getting it through in real time. So if you Google ENV compliance, it comes up on our homepage. There's a YouTube link, so feel free to check it out. It stars yours truly. So next slide, please. And yeah, there's a bit of a screenshot of the video. It's not quite the same effect, but so the first place I wanted to start is the compliance management framework. And this kind of just talks about the government of British Columbia's goals, what is Ministry of Environment's vision, which is generally a clean, healthy, and naturally diverse environment. And then there's Ministry of Environment's compliance goals. And then within that, that would be compliance with all regulatory requirements to protect the environment. And then under that is our compliance objectives, which is a 4-part model. Next, please. The government does like its tiering and its operating procedures and its visions and goals. So we just kind of go through a lot of this, how it's set up, but this is what allows us to do the jobs that we're doing, that it gives us the legal authority to issue authorizations, and then the standardization to how do we determine compliance and then follow up as well. So our compliance model is basically 4 parts: setting requirements, promoting compliance, verifying compliance, and then how do you respond to those non-compliances. Next slide, please. So the setting of the requirements is like a lot of what Jen went through with the authorization process, is that you need to have some kind of requirement or some kind of authorization to comply with. So under the Environmental Management Act, that sets the powers, the delegations, the offenses and penalties, and what gives us as a government body the authority to do these things. Within there are regulations and codes of practice that Jen described earlier, as well as site-specific permits and operational certificates. So the first step of compliance is you have to set a requirement to comply to. Next, please. The second part of our compliance model is obviously promoting compliance. We want to make sure people are aware of the authorizations they have and understand them. So we do presentations like this. We attend trade shows. We have a lot of written promotional material, pamphlets, videos like the one I'd mentioned earlier. We have a pretty robust website, ENB Compliance. It's easy to find. So we do a lot of compliance outreach before, during, and after inspections as well, to hopefully obtain voluntary compliance, that people are aware and understand the authorization they have, and that they are willing and able to comply with that authorization. Next, please. So after we set the requirement, we promote compliance, make people aware of that. Then the third part of the model is verifying compliance, and that simply means inspections. And that is where myself or other staff that I work with go out into the field. A lot of you probably have received notifications from us to set up an inspection, perhaps announced or unannounced. The inspectors will at times do an office review inspection, which is a review of the submitted data and plans and other paperwork we have on file here at the office. That's been kind of our standard go-to during COVID, where it was not really the best idea to be going to multiple sites like we usually do. So we do have triggers, like what a lot of people are very interested in. Why am I being inspected? What brought this up? So some of our triggers are, it could be a planned inspection. I'm part of the plan team. That means every so often, depending on the nature of your facility, how big it is, where you discharge, it's like a standardized, you just kind of come up in the rotation to be inspected. There are incidents or complaints where something has happened, or we have been notified from the public that something is going on. So then a compliance inspector, that's our reactive team, they would reach out to the operator or the authorized representative of the wastewater facility, ask what's going on, and then probably come by for an inspection based on that trigger. Other ones are, it could be part of an audit. The third team in compliance, so there's planned, myself, it's a very standardized kind, react to incidents, and then there is the provincially significant projects or heavy industry. They conduct a lot of audits. So that again would be a standardized section that they would choose, and then they would all be inspected under that project. As I mentioned, inspections can be announced or unannounced, depending if they're high, medium, or low risk. That kind of depends on how often you would be inspected. So we kind of skipped slides there. Oh yeah, so this would be the part 4. How do we respond to non-compliance? Oh, and this was just talking about our totals. 25% of the authorizations per year, and depending on the staff and year, we've had anywhere from 1,200 to 2,000 inspections per year. Next, please. So the fourth part of the compliance model is how do we respond to non-compliance? So you have a requirement. We promote that requirement that you have. We inspect against it. What do we do when we find things that are non-compliant? So we do have a compliance and enforcement policy and procedure manual. So everything that we do is under that guideline. Again, that's easily found online if you want to know what inspectors do and how they're trained, and what we are looking for and how we evaluate our decisions. So usually if we find something, we put it into our very fancy sounding non-compliance decision matrix. Not that we're computers, but it kind of sounds that way. It is open to enforcement discretion and our own interpretation of the situation, but generally it's on two axes. One is actual or harm to environmental and human health. That's levels 1 through 5, 1 being very minimal, 5 being somewhat catastrophic. And then the other one is likelihood of compliance, and that's A through E. A is people are willing and available and ready and capable to comply with the non-compliance, up to E, which is willful or misleading falsification of data. So a lot of the spectrum of non-compliances are in there. It could be a really big incident, but the facility is trying hard to rectifying it, doing everything they can, communicating properly, as opposed to there could be a lower level non-compliance, but if the system operators or facility just ignores the compliance officers, some of our advisories or warnings, and they don't do anything, and they have no willingness to comply or don't even try, then that would edge up the category to a higher value, I guess. Next, please. So I wanted to touch a bit on our compliance enforcement tools, like what do we do? What is the outcome of our inspections? We talked a bit about the environmental compliance policy, the policies, procedures, frameworks, policies, all that stuff. But for me and the other inspectors, once we inspect the facility and we go through the works, we look at the sampling data, whatever we find, we have basically 5 options for the type of inspection report that would come back to the facility. Notice means nothing was found. There was a thank you for letting us join you and do the inspection. Advisory is kind of a lower level non-compliance where we're advising you that there's an issue. A warning is kind of a stronger response that we are now officially warning you of the non-compliances we have found and that we are directing you to take action to fix that. And if you don't, then we will move on to things like administrative monetary penalties, perhaps orders, administrative sanctions. There's a lot of different options, but the warning is kind of in the middle, and then that's the official warning that we're going to proceed. So things need to happen, and there's a 30-day requirement in there to respond to the ministry with an official plan of what you plan to do. Again, the video that we talked about at the beginning, it kind of describes a lot of those compliance tools and enforcement tools in more descriptive manner. And then the other one is the conservation officer service. We are inspectors, we're not investigators. We don't have the powers that they do, so we cannot investigate. So when we see more egregious situations or things that perhaps require a more legal angle to address them, then we work with the conservation officer service, and they have the ability to investigate, issue tickets, and also court prosecutions. Next, please. And I thought that this might be a good way to get into some of the common non-compliances that we see as inspectors. And this might help a lot of the operators out there. Like, what do you expect when we're inspecting? What are we going to look for? What are we going to ask for? What are some of the main things we see? So I thought I'd go through some of the common non-compliances. Next, please. And being an EOCP conference, I thought I would touch on some of the EOCP related clauses that are right in the MWR. Next. So the first one is the facility has to be classified. So it's right in there in section 45C. A discharger must not discharge until all the requirements are met. And then 45C says the wastewater facility is classified under the EOCP. So any wastewater facility that is discharging has to be classified. Next, please. And that's basically just a clause how it's written in the inspection report that it comes out. Next.
Darren, I'd like to add one point there while I'm thinking of it. On
Sure.
classification for facilities, operators, I'm not sure if you're aware that you can get a pre-classification as well. So if you're looking at building a new facility, you're able to reach out to the EOCP and talk to them and see what they're expecting you to fit into for a classification based on your design. So that can be really helpful in the pre-application processes.
Yep, it helps. All those things help to shorten the timeline that it takes when you're going through the authorization process. So this would be the database and kind of the what we look up and then the result in the inspection report. So a lot of the inspectors, myself included, we just log into the EOCP classification page and do a search. We find the facilities that we're looking for, and the number of the classification, the date, and the expiration is all in there. So we just use the findings straight from the EOCP database to establish compliance with that. Next, please. At times we do contact the EOCP directly if we have a unique situation or we're searching for a facility that can't be found. So we sometimes would ask them directly, perhaps a name change or something. And again, on the inverse of that, if we search the database and it is not classified, and we follow up with the EOCP and it turns out it is not, then that's a non-compliance, and then the actions to be taken is have your system classified appropriately. Next. So not only does the facility have to be classified, the operators have to be certified. So again, we go into the EOCP's CRM system, the Customer Relationship Management System, which works very well for us here at the ministry. And we do a search. If you're certified, you're on that database, and 47B explicitly says that the facility has to be operated and maintained by persons who are certified. Next. So again, there's the clause, and we'll skip that one too. And then we go in and it says if the operator's number, when their certification was granted, what level they're at, and if they're in good standing and certified, and the dates attached. So that helps us determine compliance. Next. And then again, on the inverse of that, based on CEUs not being met or perhaps an expiration of your certification, that again would confirm with us under 47B that the system is not operated by a certified operator. Next. And again, this is just how it would be written out, that when the discharge commences, they do not have certification, and then we would go through in the type of system and then what classification would be needed there. This would be an interesting one because this specific example, that specific non-compliance was already identified previously. So that would be a case that we would look at of perhaps escalating that if it was not addressed the first time, then the next time there may be might be elevated in our decision matrix. Next. So those are the two main ones under the EOCP. And actually in 2018, our PSP, our Provincially Significant Projects team, they did complete a qualified professional compliance audit of municipal wastewater facilities around the province. And I believe one of my colleagues completed this one, and they assessed 72 municipal systems, and over half were out of compliance with either the certification of the facility or the certification of the operator. So some of the common ones were continuing education units lapsing, dues, the certification itself had lapsed, or perhaps the operator was completely uncertified as well. Or a lot of times, designated operators were not uploaded into the system because some operators kind of switch around, some leave, or they get hired on as a new client and operate a system. Just kind of a reminder that if that person is the designated operator of that system, that getting that updated information into the CRM, into the EOCP database is very important. Next. So again, I thought I'd talk about some other non-compliances that we see. And in general, they kind of fall into 4 different categories. So administrative, discharge and the flow itself, the quality of that discharge, and then unauthorized discharges or activities. Next. So administrative is an interesting one. Is we call it paperwork related, or something is at issue with the administrative or the record keeping or the paperwork side of things. So a very common one is the operating plan. Every facility under the MWR needs to have an operating plan, and the facility is bound to adhere to that operating plan. So the main 3 are prepare, adhere, and update. A lot of facilities have outdated operating plans. Maybe they were originally written back when the facility was first being commissioned or going to be installed. And, it could be 20 years old by now, and a lot of different things change. A lot of reporting requirements have changed, notification of health officers, updated emergency personnel, um, different emergency procedures, perhaps even the works themselves have changed. As time goes on and systems get updated, especially with municipalities as funding comes in, perhaps the system they had when they were first authorized, they are updating it, they are adding additional works. So that is also a common one, is that either works are missing or extra works have been installed, and the outdated information in the registration itself. So that's where a lot of the times the inspector, the actions to be taken would be apply to amend your authorization to make to be reflective of current site conditions. So that's where then you would go to the authorizations group, and as Jen mentioned earlier, you would go through the amendment process to have what is actually happening and occurring and present on site be reflective of what's in the administrative side of it with the plans and the registration itself. Next, please. So discharge flow, obviously these are discharge permits, and that is one of the most common non-compliances we see. And there's kind of two things. One is monitoring the flow itself. The MWR requires there to be a suitable flow measurement device, usually that is capable of measuring the flow within a 24-hour period. So I have a picture of a pretty common totalizer that we see a lot of the times. Average, just taking a weekly or monthly flow and averaging over a 24-hour period, generally is not a suitable flow measurement device. Some people use pump curves or a variety of other ways to estimate what a flow is, but flow monitoring in the MWR is pretty explicit how it's described. So sometimes the device isn't working well, or it's not suitable for what the MWR requires, it's inoperable, or a lot of the time there's just discharge period recording errors that are not collecting the 24-hour flow data that is necessary. Some of the older permits, they do allow for like less exact measurements, whether they're averages or on a total over a span of time. But with the MWR, that's not allowable anymore. And then the other main non-compliance with discharge and flow is obviously the flow limits themselves. There's a daily max associated in a lot of permits, and sometimes there's annual averages as well. And there's the registered amount of flow that your system is capable of discharging, and then exceedances of those flow limits are actually probably the most common non-compliance we see in municipal wastewater. Next.
Quick points to pipe up on those ones.
Sure.
If you're not sure what a suitable flow measuring device is, there's a great section in the BC Field Sampling Manual. In section E, there's a whole part written about flow measuring devices. So if you're looking for a reference, that's a good place to go to get the information.
Good point.
Yep.
Okay, we're getting pretty close to the question section, guys.
Okay, I'll just go through. I just have a few more slides. That's it.
Okay, thanks.
So effluent quality, again, be aware of your parameter limits, exceedances of effluent quality, whether it's BOD or TSS or nitrogen or any other parameters that are specified in the MWR or your permit. And then a big one to be aware of too is the actual monitoring itself. Perhaps there's a missed sample, or perhaps the sample is obtained, you forget to check the box on the chain of custody, lack of analysis. Sampling frame, the MWR states that how often you sample. There's also a required gap time between your samples, whether they're monthly or quarterly, just so you can't stack all your samples in a certain time frame, that they have to be spread out through the operating period. Next. And then the last one is unauthorized discharges. These are spills, overflows, breakouts, daylighting. A lot of those also need to be reported immediately to the ministry, and this, as per the spill reporting regulation as well. Next. And then that's where it comes to the data and report submissions. So we have 2 automated email addresses for data and report submission. So any quarterly, monthly, annual reporting, all your samples, flow data. And then there's the non-compliance reporting that per the MWR and a lot of permits that there is a requirement in there that you have to submit the data in a regular systematic fashion to the ministry, but also if something does go wrong, a lot of times the only way we know at the ministry is if the regulated party reports that to us as well. So there is a requirement and a non-compliance reporting email inbox as well. Next. And then also the RAP line, public complaints, a lot of that information comes through there, and that's also would be used for spill reporting. Next. And then, yeah, a big thank you and time for questions. And if you have any more information or want any more information about environmental compliance, the matrix, to view the video, or any questions, gov.bc.ca, environmental compliance. We have an extremely robust online presence, as most people do now. So a lot of the times, if you do have any questions, they can be answered by going onto our website and looking a bit more into it. But we also have the ability to intake questions from there as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much, guys. That was very informative. We've got a list of questions. I'll be straight up right now. We're not going to be able to get through all of them in the time frame that we've got. So I recommend that some of those questions be sent through the email or the web page that's announced up there. But for starters, we have a question from Chris. About BODs. Have you considered using CODs as a here, I'll read the question properly. Hang on a second. Hang on a second.
I'm pretty sure I know what the question is. It's going to be about
BODs and CODs. Yes.
Is CBOD an acceptable substitute for BOD 5?
Correct.
I would direct that person to the definition section of the municipal wastewater reg, and right there in the regulation itself, in the MWR, it says BOD5 means the carbonaceous 5-day biochemical oxygen demand. So COBD or CBOD is actually defined in the municipal wastewater reg as such, that is a suitable sample parameter.
Okay, so thank you. The next one was from Owen, and I think his question is there any overlap between the BC WW legislation and the federal wastewater system effluent regulation? And I think he's referring to the harmonization.
The WISR, yeah. I would let Jen maybe take this, because when I first arrived at the ministry in 2016, harmonization was the buzzword of the day, but I'm not really sure how that came to be or what happened. So Jen, I don't know if you want to.
There was a discussion at one point a couple of years back, but unfortunately the harmonization didn't happen the way that everybody kind of hoped it would. So the requirements are actually separate. There is a federal set of requirements. They're for larger systems, but when you guys are putting a proposal in, you would have to meet the provincial standards. And if your system was big enough and was going to fall under the federal regulation as well, you'd have to be capable of meeting those standards as well. They are different between the two, so you'd have to look at both types of standards.
Okay, thank you very much. Another one comes from John. He was asking, do you do remote inspections on the wastewater systems in mines and gas camps?
Yes.
You do? Okay.
Yes. A lot of the time it does depend on accessibility and obviously the financial restrictions of the ministry. Those being on the road system are much easier to get to and to inspect, but sometimes it's an opportunistic inspection that when our heavy industry inspectors are at a mine or at a remote site, that they would inspect all the permitted discharges in the area. So man camps, logging camps, the smaller sewage systems that they have there. At times we do joint inspection trips with either Environment Canada, sometimes the COS, Sometimes we piggyback with some of our monitoring and stewardship biologists. We do have boats available to us, and then sometimes we'll get a lot of the remote lodges and camps and things like that. Those are usually the hardest ones to get to because it could take a couple days just to get to a very small facility that only has a few cubes of output. But we try to do our best. If it's financially feasible to get to these places, then we can. But a lot of the times, those smaller, very remote facilities, we rely on what's called our office inspections or a desktop, where we just go through a lot of the required material sampling paperwork for these places, and then we usually call or video chat with these people. Sometimes we will get them to supply us with photographs and obviously other sample results and whatnot, but we do what we can, and there is a bit of a cost benefit analysis to some of these really small remote facilities.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Lawrence, Chris, Sandra, Colin, I'm apologizing. We're not going to get to your questions. We'll try to figure out if we can get them addressed.
Well, they can always email me. Our email addresses, I believe, are in the presenter program. So,
okay. Well, we'll.
If you ever have a question, feel free to contact me. Or environmental compliance, there is a general inquiry line there that you can always submit any questions you may have.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. So that wraps up. EOCP, thanks you guys very much for your presentation.
Thanks, everybody.
It was very informative. And hopefully EOCP will send you a couple of lunch bags thank yous for your efforts.
Okay.
Appreciate
thank you.
it.
Thanks very
Bye,
much.
everyone. Thanks for attending.
Okay.
Have a good afternoon.